The other thing that's come up recently that the people who really look into the detail on this have pointed out is the increasing use of fiber optic cable on drones, because that helps you reduce or sometimes eliminate the ability of the adversary to jam your drone. And by that we mean a drone is literally connected by a kilometers long cable to an operator or an offset control point, which means you are flying it whilst it's trailing cable for 10 or 15 kilometers of very fine cable to then conduct a strike. And I'm sure we'll then see a response to that, and that there will be countermeasures applied to get at the cable or track it back to its source, or to interfere with the ability of the drone to physically get to its target. So, that battle will continue to evolve. That isn't the end point of that evolution, but that's the kind of thing that's going on around the ground on the front line.
Obviously, we've spoken a lot about the supply issues for Ukraine, but I was struck that you said that, yes, Russia are able to make some small gains, but at a big cost. What form does that cost take?
It's both material stuff, equipment and weapons, and people. So what seems to be coming out, and this includes sort of Western intelligence briefing, are very high levels of casualties. And the way that they're operating is relatively blunt force, essentially. They have a lot of people that they can put into small attacks. So these aren't operations that involve thousands of people using a combination of armor and then dismounting, a large coordinated offensive. It's repeated small attacks that just wear down Ukrainian defenders, that they have to constantly be on alert, that they are constantly being pressured, that there is a high level of overhead surveillance and strike activity being conducted by drones of various types. And that costs the Russians a lot. And now it sounds like it's costing the North Koreans who have joined them in Kursk. But what it does is it means that the pressure is relentless, and that enables them to both spot small gaps and push through. It's just also the psychological pressure on Ukrainian defenders. And the reason why that accumulates and causes larger problems for Ukraine is that it means that it's very difficult for them to rotate people, and particularly units, off the front line, to give them a break, to re-equip them, to resupply them. And so it becomes expensive to do so, and just it's a complicated operation. And there has been some reporting and evidence that some Russian advances have taken place when Ukrainian rotations haven't been perfectly executed, and that's produced gaps that the Russians have taken advantage of. I mean, this is all ferociously complicated. That sounds like quite an unsophisticated approach. In and amongst this, there is then a sophisticated battle over certain elements of technology, for example, the use of electronic warfare, and then counters to that, different kinds of drones, different ways that they're being used. So I don't want to give the impression that this is simply sort of a human wave attack. There is also a constant backwards and forwards on tactics and technology that's happening behind the scenes.
And the electronic warfare is really interesting, because there's been a lot of reporting in recent weeks about some of the innovative approaches that particularly Ukraine have been using in Kursk to disrupt Russian drones. What do we know about that?
Publicly, not a huge amount, although I think there are, lots of people who are now, including my team, doing research into aspects of this. What came out, and it's worth noting this is from a variety of sources, some of which are Russian, is that, for example, the operation over the weekend in Kursk appeared to be more successful than previous ones, in terms of using a combination of armor and troops that were mechanized, and electronic warfare to create windows where Russian observation was obscured or denied, and therefore the Ukrainians were able to coordinate that with how they advanced. There's an ongoing battle about spotting forces on the battlefield. I mean, this is across the line, and then the ability to bring in artillery, for example. In many areas, artillery is still absolutely vital, but there are some cases where, particularly on the Ukrainian side, they have used first-person view drones and other systems to compensate for either their reduced artillery supplies or targets of opportunity popping up. Although I would add that the most recent reporting suggests that there have been some parts of the front line where that large gap in artillery supply that was in play last year has been narrowed or indeed eradicated. So the delay caused by particularly the big US package at the start of last year harmed the Ukrainian cause, but lots of that material is now in the system and is flowing in. The other thing that's come up recently that the people who really look into the detail on this have pointed out is the increasing use of fiber optic cable on drones, because that helps you reduce or sometimes eliminate the ability of the adversary to jam your drone. And by that we mean a drone is literally connected by a kilometers long cable to an operator or an offset control point, which means you are flying it whilst it's trailing cable for 10 or 15 kilometers, a very fine cable, to then conduct a strike. And I'm sure we'll then see a response to that, and that there will be countermeasures applied to get at the cable or track it back to its source, or to interfere with the ability of the drone to physically get to its target. So, that battle will continue to evolve. That isn't the end point of that evolution, but that's the kind of thing that's going on around the ground on the front line.
I mean, that is really fascinating about the fiber optic cables. Presumably, you can't do that at scale, because if you had all these drones flying around with fiber optic cables, it would just become messy. I mean, how would that work?
I would have said, yes, that's very difficult to do at scale. But we've seen images of apparently fiber optic cable drones operating in wooded areas, which, I would have said as a layperson would have been extraordinarily difficult, but it's achieved. The big thing that is still the case with a lot of FPV drones, regardless of whether they are fiber optically controlled or not, is that broadly speaking, you have one operator per drone. And that creates the personnel, if you like, bill for the use of those drones, is that somebody is controlling a single munition that is going at a single target per strike, basically. And that is often a limiter. I think the experimentation or any innovation that we see that enables swarms to be operated, perhaps, queued off a single human controlled drone, will be the point at which people can increase the scale of those kind of effects. And that's why, for example, they're often been using to complement artillery, because, a single artillery piece can fire multiple rounds per minute with a small crew and then move and then fire again with a time lag. Whereas one of the things that FPV operators have found is that, of course, they're largely speaking static when they're controlling, and therefore they have to hide themselves and obscure the signal, hence why you get some offset.
Let's talk about, I suppose, the elephant in the room, which is Donald Trump. We're just under 2 weeks now from his inauguration. I suppose the difficulty is no one really knows what approach his administration is going to take to the war. And in a way, that's deliberate. I mean, he sort of deliberately tries to pursue this policy of almost creative ambiguity and of unpredictability, so that all sides are guessing. But what is your sense, Matthew, of how the administration is likely to, at least in the beginning, approach the war?
So, I mean, this feels really speculative, because I think what many of us have been trying to do is read the tea leaves of the people that have been appointed to the administration and draw conclusions from that. And the problem there is that the picture is mixed. So you have a vice president who has been pretty clear on his skepticism over continued support for Ukraine. But the proposed, or the identified special representative on Ukraine, former General Kellogg, wrote a piece last year and has talked about being pretty tough on Russia as a means of enabling early negotiations. The question is, which of these voices wins out? And that is where it's genuinely hard to know how Trump will come down, because sometimes he's been quite open to, if you know, like the last person he spoke to. I think it's fair to say, though, his inclinations have been pretty consistently expressed as skeptical towards the value of continued support for Ukraine. I would say that what the Ukrainians have done is pin their hopes on presenting him with an argument when he comes in that the current situation is not conducive to a good negotiated outcome, and that he wouldn't want to be associated with that. And therefore, what he should do is boost support, even if that's over a compressed time frame, in order to give them a better chance of a win that he could credit himself with. I honestly don't know if that approach will work. You can see the way that they've been talking about it is aimed at trying to appeal to that. I just don't know if it will land, because it so much of it depends on when he sits down on the 20th of January or the 21st of January and he gets a Ukraine update. How does he feel about that? Does he see an opportunity there to cut a good deal? Does he see it as a largely negative situation and he wants to cut his losses? Or does he come up with some sort of compromise, which is, well, maybe I'll see how this plays out? And I honestly don't know. My feeling is that he doesn't have the kind of patience for the sustained investment that is necessary, both by the US and, we shouldn't forget, Europe, and that time is against the Ukrainians, because the situation that they want to be in, that is desirable for them, requires some fairly significant battlefield success to push the Russians back, and that will take time, and it's time that they don't have. So I don't know what the answer is in terms of, will he kind of help them maneuver into a reasonable negotiated settlement? But I would say that whatever takes place in the early months of this year is unlikely to be really where they want to be.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.